Yeah, and it's definitely it's very much buyer driven, but ultimately it should help strengthen relationships where relationships are healthy. But also it gets away from this scenario of businesses just saying they can't do it anymore. They can't just say, "What did we spend last year? 200 million. Well, it's to budget. Great." And therefore the CFO says, "Oh, we're at hard times. We've got to chop 20% off that next year." That just doesn't stack up because just being to budget isn't good enough because you might be wasting money, and B, cutting your budget might actually be a very detrimental thing to do because the consulting work or the supplier that's delivering some services for you might be significantly contributing to the top line or bottom line. You need to recognize that, you need to understand it, but COVID has played a big part in pushing the statement of work agenda, not just in terms of overall cost control and people understanding what they're getting for their money, but also just this kind of acceptance of more outsourcing and even just like with lots more people working remotely, there's just a general workforce shift towards deliverable outcomes, whether you see that in the gig economy or in the kind of larger transactions.
I mean, something else that I'll be kind of interested in your view on in that kind of technology environment is the joining together of data. So for example, let me give you a scenario. Big organization, big corporate, they've got a lot of work that needs doing, and the value of that work's £1 million. Whether it's done through a statement of work, consultancy project, or a contingent worker is up to the budget holder. And what I have seen in the past happen is, if there's a headcount freeze on, then it's like, well, okay, I'll do it on contingent. But if there's a freeze around, if there's IR35 issues, then they say, well, okay, then I'll stick it onto consultancy. And then you go, is it capitalized or is it OPEX? Is it CapEx or OPEX? It's like, well, what's best for us at the moment? Bringing all that together so that the exec team have a view of what are we spending on consultancy? What are we spending on contingent workforce? What are we spending on CapEx versus OPEX within those categories? So joining together what was the old VMS systems with these kind of statement of work systems, I think that's going to be interesting about, is there a common key? Can you look across between both systems? Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of centralization of data and centralization of the process, buying something under a statement of work is very different to buying contingent workers.
Exactly.
The contingent workforce technical problem is very well solved by the big VMS providers.
Yeah.
So that's a solved problem. With statement of work, it's more of an emerging solution with people like ourselves, but it is separate. Like, you wouldn't necessarily start a statement of work requirement in a vendor management system.
No, I mean, you can. Some of them, I think, did have SOW modules, but to your point, Johnny, they came from a contingent workforce world and bolted on SOW, and that's very different.
Yeah, I mean, we see the two things as extremely different, and I think we're a specialist. So if you're very focused in one area, you can absolutely devote all of your product development and everything about the experience to make that work as best as possible. So we take very much the kind of best of breed approach to just purely services delivered under a statement of work. But with regards to kind of centralizing the process, we see some people kind of going a level above that and saying initially, and this is where it ties into strategic workforce planning and that overall kind of approach to what's the best way to get the work done, where it's a question of saying, here's the piece of work, this is what it looks like, and the organization needs either some advice from like a recruitment managed service provider, workforce solutions provider, or internally to have systems set up or channels set up to say, this is what I need to do, this is what it looks like, what's the best way for me to get that done? Exactly. Well, that looks like it's best to be a permanent employee, go and stick it into Workday, or it's a contingent worker, stick it in the VMS, or it's an SOW, punch it out to the SOW tech.
And in fact, what we wanted was, we used to have the concept, I don't know if it's happened, of some kind of machine learning assisted decision support tool, where a budget holder went through a decision support tool to go, is this best for statement of work, or is it best for contingent, or is it best for hiring? And it asks you a series of questions, and you go through this kind of like exercise, because it made it much more rational. It made it much more criteria based. And I can see, we talked earlier about the different systems that are around and what happens at the level up. I think that kind of glue, that decision support glue that says, well, which is the best route to go down, I think, again, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it can be done pretty simply. And if you start from a simple point, you can always add layer on complexity to it. But I think if you look at it, however that decision is made, whether that is made within internal procurement criteria that just spell out, if it looks like this, go over here, if it looks like that, go over there, or whether it's coming from a triage service that might be provided by a workforce solutions provider as part of that process, where they might do other stuff as well, like help them write a good SOW, or if it's contingent, help them write a good job spec, etc.
Like a global MSP. If you've got a global MSP, then they will have that kind of like decision support office. Requests go in, it gets triaged, and it gets sent out through the right route. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you look at the other end of it, in terms of the data, we integrate with systems like Power BI, Tableau, Sisense, things like that, where people might just say, well, actually, we do most of our data crunching in a BI tool.
Exactly.
So what, for example, the VMS might have their own internal dashboards and then push the data out. We have our internal dashboards, just people to see on real time and assess stuff, and then push the data out as well. So they could do the real data crunching in a centralized data warehouse. And I think that's where, it's very interesting when you start talking about things like comparing the value of, or the return on investment of outsourcing something versus getting permanent employees to do it. Yeah. Because I personally think that the value thing is like it's the ultimate. That is a little bit of a way off. People have got to capture the process, understand the data, get more of an idea of return from the suppliers that they're using and comparative quality and what they're actually getting for their money. Then the value conversation ties into all of that data, that quantitative data plus the qualitative input onto, are they doing a good job or not? Yeah. And it kind of feeds back into the overall strategy of the business. But fundamentally, measuring what a perm person is delivering against a consultancy is very difficult, but they're working in different ways. I think where the organization has clearly made a decision that this is best to be done in this manner, you need to be able to have comparative value within that category, as you do with all categories. And then that's where some clever stuff needs to happen at the strategic workforce planning level, but if you've got data, then you can start to do this. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you've got data, you can start really picking it apart.
Yeah. And that strategic workforce planning piece, and there are vendors out there that provide that kind of those tools at a kind of macro level, is, you are looking for like, well, in this quarter, in this year, given that this year is full of uncertainty for an awful lot of organizations, then you obviously want to reduce your commitments. You want to make sure that you've got flexibility. So taking on a lot more headcount quickly may not suit the organization. So I'm now going to have a blend of some contractors. I'm going to have a bit more headcount in certain positions, and I'm going to do more consultancy, fixed price, project-based work. You can start to adapt it as the economic environment and your own environment changes. And that, I think, is where, then you can start to work out, where do I deploy my spend best, given the environment within which I'm in and the risk I'm prepared to take.